It's really wonderful to be here. And unfortunately, being retired is extremely time-consuming. I'm very, very busy, so I can have to leave this morning and go back to Edinburgh. But I hope to be able to talk to you a little bit in the break before then. Now, I've been asked to talk about paradiplomacy, which is the external activities of state actors of various sorts, whether they're cities, regions, stateless nations, and so on. And you might think at first glance, what's new about that? Why is that significant? And it's only significant because during the 20th century we got used to the idea that foreign activities was the exclusive prerogative of nation states. And historically that's really the exception. So in many ways what we're seeing now is a return to normality. But because before the rise of the nation state in the 18th and 19th century, there were principalities and city-states and regions and all kinds of polities of various sorts that engaged in interactions of various types. So the first thing we really have to explain is how we got from there to the idea that international relations is the exclusive competence of the nation state. And this happened, and I'm going to give you a 5-minute excursus into a huge range of theory here about territory and power and politics. What we saw in the course of the 19th century was a process of bounding of territory on the part of nation states. Sometimes existing states bound territory more tightly. In other cases, new states were created. And boundary making was all about enclosing territory in various ways. First of all, on a security basis, the state is the unit for defense and the maintenance of order, with literal boundaries, fortifications. And then there was economic integration through the creation of national markets, the closing of national borders, different regimes, whether free trade or protectionist, but there was a regulation of trade. There was cultural integration through education, through mobility, military service, so as to create more homogeneous populations. There never were homogeneous populations, of course, but more cultural homogeneity. And then in the 20th century, there was the welfare state, which put a territorial boundary around social solidarity and welfare matters. And then we have this 20th century nation state in which there's a certain complementarity between the scope of the market, the scope of the welfare system, the cultural unit, the political unit, and the unit of identity. And politics then took place within these more or less enclosed spaces. Now that's an exaggeration because of course we've got to exaggerate to stress the point because states were never totally sealed. But that is the ideal type there. And on that basis, states became the main units for international relations. And at that point, indeed, the disciplines of political science and international relations separated for reasons that I've never understood, except to do with developments in universities in North Wales, in Aberystwyth. They founded a Department of International Relations. And ever since then, they've been regarded as separate disciplines, which in my opinion is utterly absurd, but that's the way that academia works. So there's domestic politics and there's international politics. Now, in the early days of the consolidated nation state, this, by the way, which is sometimes referred to in the international relations literature as the Westphalian state. This is historically incorrect. The Peace of Westphalia in 1848 didn't create nation states. Some reason somebody got it in their head in the 19th century that it happened. It's much later. It's the 19th century where you see the consolidated nation state. Diplomacy, international relations, was initially concerned with two things. One was security matters, war and peace, and the other was the regulation of trade. And these were the monopoly of the state. And within that, you got domestic politics, which were seen and conceptualized by academics in these two disciplines as being quite discrete areas. Now, that was never true, but it's decreasingly true in the contemporary world for a number of reasons. About 30 years ago, at the end of the Cold War, there was a big debate about globalization. You still hear people talk about globalization now, and about the end of territory and a borderless world. was Bertrand Bardy's book, La fin des territoires, and another French book called La fin de la démocratie, because after the nation state, you can have no democracy, a very French notion. Crisis, territory has disappeared. In fact, territory never went away. What had happened was that the nation states had lost their ability to monopolize territory, to define territory, to patrol boundaries. But territory is still around, and territory is an essential element in any social and economic system. And some of us have spent a very long time trying to bring back territory into the study of politics. And rather than the end of territory, what we saw was a shifting of territorial scales, what some of us call rescaling. That is, different systems, different economic, social, political systems, identities were still attached to territory, but not monopolized by the nation state. And the economic boundaries, the political boundaries, the identity boundaries, the boundaries of social solidarity no longer coincided very well, because some systems were scaled upwards, some systems were scaled downwards. So if we look at the economy, it is true that there are global economic patterns. You can trace a global economy which comes and goes. We're probably in a phase of deglobalization at the moment, this year, but there was a phase of globalization. It wasn't new. They got the same thing in the late 19th century, in which you couldn't understand the economy simply by looking at nation states. You had to look at global patterns. But at the same time, we've seen a localization of the economy. There's a whole literature about local economic development and the way that you cannot understand economic change, dynamism, growth, recession, without looking at what's happening in particular places. Some of this has got to do with the sociology of places, some of it's got to do with proximity. We don't have time to get into the whole of that literature, but the rise of regions and cities as economic spaces is a very significant development. So we're seeing a globalization and a localization in the domain of the economy. If one looks at culture and languages, particularly minority languages that some of us are interested in, and which Colin is, of course, a great scholar of, we're seeing minority languages at one sense becoming global because you can communicate electronically and you don't need space. But on the other hand, we're seeing a territorialization of these languages. So in Canada, French retreats to Quebec. It strengthens in Quebec and retreats elsewhere. Welsh is unevenly distributed across the territory of Wales. So in those domains of culture, we're seeing globalization and localization at the same time. On my own industry in higher education, there's a global market in higher education, but we also know that universities are tightly bound to their local communities in a way that probably wasn't true in the past. And when it comes to welfare, the welfare state, again, the nation state is the main actor in welfare, the welfare state, but we're also seeing local welfare system, the emergence of local centers of solidarity. And then, of course, when it comes to the great challenge of the environment and climate change, that is a global problem that impinges locally on particular places. And so all the work we've done about environmental politics and territory shows that this is something that operates all the way from the global to the local. You can't confine it to one particular territory. So we're seeing this process of rescaling. And one response of governments to this process of rescaling has been to restructure government. Now, there's a lot of literature about this derived from the globalization literature, which is functionally determinist, which says, oh, we've got globalization, therefore nation states will collapse. There was a book by Kenichi Ome. I've stopped citing it because he gets too many citations. If you cite bad books all the time by saying, by the way, this is a bad book, they get lots of citations and they become very famous. So they stop doing it. In which he talks about the rise of the global world and the end of the nation state. And the rise of the local economy is the end of the nation state. Politics, economics, all wrapped up into one thing. Or as Alessina and Spogliari, a famous book about the size of nations. Well, in an area of free trade, you get smaller nations. They mean states, but never mind. You get smaller states. It's automatic. But this is just not true, because all of this is mediated by politics, and it creates winners and losers. So my argument is that rescaling is an intensely political process, and drawing the boundaries defines inclusion and exclusion from systems, whether it's the welfare state or an economic system or a cultural community. It alters the balance of power, and the implications of this new regionalism are highly contested as well. So if we think about the rise of regions, which has been one of the great themes in comparative politics in Europe over the last 30 years ago, the rise of this meso-level, and why we get meso-level governments now in Spain, in Belgium, in France, in Italy, they sort of in the United Kingdom, yes, in Wales and in Scotland and Northern Ireland, but in England it's highly problematic. How is this coming about? It's because of politics. It's essentially political actors are using these opportunities to establish new systems. Now, states can take advantage of this or try to regain control of systems that they've lost by reconstituting them at different levels. This is the basis of the European project. We can't run national economies. We can maybe get some leverage on this at the European level. Similarly, at the regional level, regional institutions are ways of mastering problems that can't be mastered at the national level, and then regions become contested and politicized. So we start off with a technocratic phase of Europeanization and regionalism. That's still there, but then the losers mobilize. They say, hold on, this is not the kind of Europe we want. We want a more social Europe or a more environmental Europe. And so it's politicized. Similarly, at the urban and the regional level, you get development strategies, and we had lots of these from the 1960s in the UK, which are very technocratic, top-down. They're trying to do this again in England. In fact, they're even trying to extend that approach to Scotland and Wales at the moment. It's not political, it's just good policy. But the losers will mobilize, and that's why you get this movement towards elected governments as the only way of resolving these issues in a democratic system. Now, sometimes I like to provoke people by saying, this is a move from governance to government. And a proofreader kindly corrected me and said, no, it's government to governance. We all know that. I said, no, it's not. It's whatever governance is what we had before, an array of bodies and technical bodies of various sorts and agencies coexisting in space towards something looking like government. And that's what we're getting. So we're getting the growth of government. Europe gradually moving towards something looking more like a government, and similarly at the sub-state level. Now, all of that is the context for thinking about paradiplomacy, because these developments really erode the distinction between domestic and international policy, because they all have a local dimension and a state dimension and an international dimension. Regional governments have been endowed with competences of various sorts. There are some commonalities. They're all concerned with economic development in one way or another. They all have some service responsibilities. They have planning and infrastructure responsibilities, and some of them have very extensive responsibilities, like the Welsh Senedd and the Welsh Government have extensive responsibilities over education and social services and something like that. So the competencies are very, very, very different. But these are now political systems and political actors. Now, just contemplating the debates about regions and regionalism across Europe, how are we to understand this? This is really important before I pitch into talking about paradiplomacy per se. For some people, there's a very economistic notion about this whole movement towards meso-level government and this whole rescaling. It's kind of functionally determined. And the argument is because we know that regions and localities are very important to understand economic development, they're not just places of economic development, they're systems, local production systems. This is not a new idea either. Very, very few ideas are new. This goes back to Alfred Marshall in the late 19th century. You can think of local production systems that you can model, and therefore it's not just the location of production. It's not just that factory happens to be there. It's part of a local production system with interconnections amongst the various elements of that. And that's become a very important theme in local economic development. And the other is the idea that regions are competing with each other. And this is very controversial. There's this neo-mercantilist notion, this is where Kenichi Ohmae comes in. Well, regions have got to compete with each other in some kind of zero-sum game. So it's mercantilist because it's assuming there's only a certain amount of wealth to go around and we're competing for it. So that regions are competing to attract capital and conquer markets and dominate new technologies. Now, some economists will tell you that is nonsense. Firms compete, regions don't compete. Others will say, well, for more political, regions compete because that's what they think they're doing. But that's a dominant theme in much of the literature there, and that suggests that regions then must emphasize economic development at the cost of everything else. One recipe for that is low taxes, low regulation, and so on, and the so-called race to the bottom. That's one version of the new regionalism. Another version of the new regionalism is, well, when that happens, you get rising inequalities and you get displacement of people and you'll get social protests, and the region will then develop as a space of social solidarity. It's our community, our local place that's being affected by that. And so that's another conception of the region. This is a space to defend welfare rights and defend standards of living and so on, and to protect the place against the intrusion of unregulated markets. Two very, very different conceptions of what regionalism is all about. And then, of course, there's the identity question. No, regions are places about culture, about common meaning. And I don't mean culture in the reified sense. I mean culture as the expression of shared understandings and shared meanings, may be expressed through a distinct language or may not, which create a sense of place and a sense of being and a sense of community. There's that sense. And then there's the sense of regions as arenas in which you play all these issues out. Now, what this amounts to then is that lots of people will try and tell you the region of the interest of this region is X, Y, and Z. Regions have interest. They don't. That's a reification. That emerges from the political competition within the region and in the broader space. And just as we have in Europe a conception about Europe which is purely based upon market competition, and an alternative one that emphasizes social and environmental dimensions, so you get at the local level, but in a context in which you don't have the hard boundaries of nation states. You don't have the tools that nation states had. You can't impose tariffs. You can't regulate trade very well. You can't necessarily impose burdens on businesses because they can move. They can displace themselves. They can move elsewhere. You can mobilize certain kinds of social solidarity, but what about your tax base? So this is an open game. There's a politics about the construction of the region, what it's all about, and within that, a politics about the priorities and what should be the priorities of this region, of this space. And that is why these meso-governments, or whether they're cities or regions, are necessarily exposed to international factors. And add to that the way in which in international relations it's no longer just about diplomacy, war and peace, and the regulation of trade. In fact, within the European Union, it's not the regulation of trade. It's not the responsibility of nation states at all. It's the responsibility of the European Union. But in international relations, there's the environment, there's human rights, there are cultural conventions, there are all kinds of things. There are educational programs, there's research and development, which are all now internationalized. So just as regions have engaged with new competencies, so in the field of international relations, the agenda has widened. International relations, international agreements and treaties cover a whole range of things, many of which are the responsibility of devolved governments. Now, why this hasn't led to anybody questioning the boundary between international relations and comparative politics is everything to do with the politics of academia, because this is an area where you can't just rely on the insights of one discipline. Okay, so I want to say something briefly about what paradiplomacy is, and then I just want to give you a few anecdotes, because it's always nice to enliven all of this by telling some stories. I'm a great believer in telling stories. That's how we learn things. We invent the theories afterwards. So paradiplomacy is conventionally thought of. I say conventionally because it's about 30, 40 years old, this idea. But the original Canadian scholars who developed this in the 1980s thought about paradiplomacy and proto-diplomacy as a distinction, because one of the things that some regions stroke nations, and I don't want to get into debating the difference of that, I could talk all day about that, but some territories, let's say, are home to movements with the aspiration to create an autonomous, self-determining unit, possibly going all the way to a nation state, but not necessarily. There's always a great deal of ambiguity. Plaid Cymru wants Welsh independence, but what do they really mean by that? Not independence in the classic sense. So it's about nation building then. It's about creating the political community, and it's about projecting that community in the international arena, possibly to the point of becoming independent, or at least becoming independence within the wide framework of the European Union. And there's the paradiplomacy, which is the more humdrum, day-to-day business. And that distinction is still useful. I wouldn't push it too far, because in practice it's difficult to label one activity as being one thing or the other. But it certainly gives a different feel to the politics of paradiplomacy. One takes into account what these people are actually doing and why they are doing it. So we have that distinction. The main fields, well, economic development is still extremely important. There's still a huge emphasis upon attracting capital, some emphasis upon trade, upon technology. You can't do this simply locally. All this literature about endogenous development emphasizes it's not truly endogenous in being sense of being autarkic. It's drawing on international resources into a particular place. So there's a big emphasis on that. There's a certain emphasis upon culture, maintaining culture, the cultural relations, particularly if you're a small culture and you're minoritized within your own state, you seek international support for that. There's a element distinct to Europe on working in Europe, working in the European Union. There was a big debate. It was exactly 30 years ago, but my friend Barry Jones and I, Barry's office was just over there, came up with this idea about regions in the European community, as it then was. What about regions in the European community? What about regions mobilizing within the European political space? And we spent the subsequent 40 years saying, don't get carried away with it. It's just, but I'm afraid we created a monster. And I don't know how many theses I've examined on this in the subsequent decades. But certainly, this is a big theme. How do sub-state actors work within the European space? That's very distinct, because in Europe there are various institutionalized opportunities to do that. There are exchanges in policy learning from each other. There are complementarities, that is, regions may think they're competing with each other, but sometimes you can get a complementarity. For example, in planning, my favorite example is airports. You've got two airports terribly close to each other, and they could cooperate, and they don't. I had to come through Cardiff Airport yesterday. I was exposed to this in space. my son lives in Bristol. So the logic of planning doesn't always work. Why not? Because there's nation building and there's region building going on here. So there are sometimes opportunities for cooperation. And then when it comes to proto-diplomacy, this is about creating an image of your nation region around the world, getting recognition for it as being not just another region, and at the very limit, trying to create an international climate that is receptive to the idea that you might become a nation state in some time in the future. There are actually very few examples of that, but there are some obvious ones. So that's what it's about. Sometimes it comes in conflict with what the states are doing. A great deal of the time it's not. There are different constitutional arrangements from it, from the Belgian case in which the regions are given, and the language communities are given the same external competencies as they have internally. That's the principle, so they're responsible for the international relations in all their domestic competencies, to, say, the Italian regions, which are much more restricted, or the French regions in their competences. So the competence question is important, but also important is the political question, the political relationships between them, and the political climate, the political tension, whether these are seen as a threat to the state or not. And being seen as a threat to the state is not always a matter of objective assessment. Sometimes it's just a perception of the state and what the state stands for. And some states are much more sensitive than others. So let me just conclude by giving you some examples of that and some vignettes. One example is from Quebec. Now, Quebec has long had a very active program of paradiplomacy, going back to the 1960s. In fact, they were doing a bit of it in the 19th century, which is about economic development, but it's also about the development and flourishing of the French language in Quebec. When the Parti Québécois is in power, things become tense because they want to become independent, but not always. And so there's always some kind of tense relationship, and the Quebec government has separate offices abroad from the Canadian government. Most of the time it works just fine because they have mutual interests. But sometimes it becomes really quite tense. And I remember a few years ago, I got a call from the Quebec office in London saying that the Premier of Quebec, Pauline Marois, was going to be in Edinburgh, and could I meet her? And I said, sorry, I can't meet her because I shall be in Quebec City on that day, talking to her officials. Indeed, I was. And I got to Quebec City, and they said, what's going on in Edinburgh? What's going on in Scotland? Because Madame la Première Ministre has just tried to contact the First Minister, and the First Minister won't talk to her. What's going on? Now, I thought we were friends. We were on the same side. This is a nationalist government in Scotland, of course, wanting independence. I said, why do you think the Scottish National Party would want to talk to a party that's lost 2 referendums and has no chance of a third one, and annoy the Canadian government? So you see, what might seem obvious alliance there becomes more complicated because the Scottish government is trying to persuade the Canadian government that it would be nice for Scotland to become independent within the Commonwealth and within the UN and so on. Just an example of those kinds of frictions that go on. But most of the time, there's not a great deal of conflict at all. Another example is from Spain, and the Basque Country and Catalonia have a very active programs of paradiplomacy. In fact, the first time I was invited to the Basque Country by Noé and his colleagues, which was again many years ago, 25 or 30 years ago, it was to look at paradiplomacy, and particularly the Basque program, paradiplomacy. Now, there is a constitutional question in the Basque Country as well. It comes tense from time to time and relaxed at other times. And then there's Catalonia. And Catalonia also has a very active paradiplomacy program. It has a public-private council, theoretically public-private, the Diplocat, the Council for Catalan Diplomacy, which represents Catalonia abroad and has offices abroad. There's quite a tense relationship with the Spanish government at the best of times, because the Spanish government sees this as somehow being a threat to its own prerogatives in foreign policy. And during the so-called process, when Catalonia was trying to get a referendum, stage an unofficial referendum on independence, I was invited by Diplocat to go around Europe talking about self-determination, and eventually they gave us a grant to do a book about self-determination. And I, of course, have no position on Catalan independence. I was neutral, so I said, I'll come along as long as both sides are represented. Now, the idea there, well, of course, they weren't supposed to be promoting Catalan independence, but the idea that we were even talking about it was such a threat to the Spanish government that it was considered highly problematic. So we used to go to these meetings, and at the back there would be somebody taking notes. And one of the meetings was the meeting in French in Louvain-la-Neuve, and somebody said, the lady at the back, where do you come? I'm doing a master's thesis here. Yes, but where do you come from, really? Oh, I'm the second secretary at the Spanish embassy in Brussels. Gotcha. So it was really friction in the air, absolutely everywhere. But because most people don't know about Catalonia, they had to tell people it exists, this question exists. Now, their strategy was really quite a curious one, because they seem to assume that they go around and talk to people nicely and explain that Catalans are very nice people, they will support Catalan independence, and that the European Union will rescue them from the grasp of these nasty Spanish people who are preventing them becoming independent. It was an unbelievably naive understanding of the way that Europe works, because Europe and European institutions and the European state are not going to do that. They're just not going to get involved in that one. So that was an effort to get involved, to take the Catalan independence question to the international arena. And it just doesn't work, and it's not surprising really that it didn't work. Another example is Scotland. Now, the Scottish government has quite an active paradiplomacy mechanism. It has representative offices which are housed in British embassies around the world, mainly in Europe and other parts of the world. I was in the one in Dublin a few years ago. There was John Webster, who is the representative of Scotland. He had his own wing of the embassy, running his own policy. This is extraordinary. Because strangely enough, the Foreign Office is, of all the departments of the British government, the one most accommodating of devolution to Scotland and Wales is the Foreign Office. Now, I've cynically said they're used to running empires and dealing with unruly natives. This is just another example of that. But there's that notion, yes, of course, the Foreign Office finds it useful for them to be there where they can keep an eye on them. So I was in the Berlin office a few months ago, and the representative said, the Foreign Office are very nice to us. In fact, sometimes they're too nice to us, because we said, let's have a Burns supper. This is the national poet. And every January the 25th, you have a big feast, and lots of whiskey is drunk, and songs and poems. We'll have a Burns supper. So the Foreign Office people said, a really good idea. We'll run it for you. Yeah, because then we can confine it to culture, and we'll make sure there's no politics there. And it's right. There are many Robert Burnses. This will be the right sanitized Robert Burns there. And then just 2 weeks ago, the First Minister of Scotland was in Brussels. Now, the First Minister of Scotland goes to Brussels regularly. They talk to Commission officials. But this time it was announced by the Foreign Office that a Foreign Office official will be accompanying the First Minister. Now, that is actually quite normal, as the government officials told me last week when I was asking them what it was all about. But the Foreign Office was saying in their announcement, we are keeping an eye, and we do not allow the First Minister of Scotland to talk to commissioners. So officially, this is a meeting between the British government and the commissioner. The First Minister of Scotland just happens to be there. Now, these are just anecdotes, but you can see the tensions, the politics of all of this. Suddenly things become very tense. Suddenly things become difficult, whereas most of the time it's regular policy making. It's quite unconflictual, it works, there are common interests. But once you get into areas of sensitivity, or governments that are particularly sensitive, because the present British government is highly sensitive about anything to do with sovereignty. That's why they did Brexit. At other times they've been more relaxed. The Canadian government sometimes more relaxed. Spanish governments are always fairly tense, but some of them are tenser than others. So this whole thing is highly imbued with politics, because it is about power. It's about redrawing boundaries. So there it is. There's just a few ideas to throw on the table there. I hope you enjoy the next couple of days, and good luck with all your research.
Thank you.